a few more people joining us. Welcome today, everyone. Today's event is part of Forum 2029, and we're looking at tax, work, incomes, building a fairer system. And this is the first one after the summer, back to school week. So thanks very much for being here. I'm Fran Boyd, your chair for the session, and I'm going to be introducing the speakers shortly. I have been told my internet is unstable, so I'm very sorry if I suddenly disappear, but Jack will no doubt step in from Autonomy. So the Forum 2029 is hosted by Autonomy Institute, and it's a series of panels to develop a progressive policy agenda in the context of economic stagnation, inertia with Labour government, and an insurgent far right currently defining the policy landscape. So there's a huge need for more progressive economic policies and more progressive policies to be hitting the headlines. We're in September, we're just 12 weeks away from a budget, and Labour's trailing reform in the polls, and they need to do something significant. So far, resisted calls for a wealth tax. Could that change? I doubt something we'll be discussing today. What are the key battlegrounds for a progressive platform to cohere around when it comes to tax, work, and income? And how can Labour be convinced to adopt them? And what does a wider progressive policy agenda look like for work and income? At a more fundamental level, how can we shift the conversation around tax, work, and income from one of scarcity and constraint to one where work and income support thriving living standards and dignity for all? Luckily, we've got an expert panel to get into these issues. We're going to be hearing from all of them and then opening up to the audience for Q&A. So we're going to hear from Caitlin Boswell, Head of Advocacy and Policy at Tax Justice UK, Rebecca Gowland, International Director for Patriotic Millionaires, and she established Patriotic Millionaires UK, Sarah Rees, Deputy Director and Head of Research and Policy at Women's Budget Group, and Alfie Sterling, Director of Policy and Insight at Joseph Rowntree Foundation. So I'm going to hand over to Caitlin to get us started.
Thanks very much. And yeah, thanks so much for having me alongside such brilliant speakers. Yeah, I wanted to talk a bit today about tax, but putting it really in our political moment that we're in, that we find ourselves in. And I think that tax can sometimes sound or is potentially a dry or boring subject. So I wanted to talk about how we can use tax as a tool to really build the kind of society that we want to see. I think we're in a really kind of exciting and also scary political moment in many ways, and we're seeing the rise of populism both on the far right and on the further left. And I think this opens up a real opportunity to push for bold economic reform, and in particular what I'm going to be talking about today and what Bex will also be talking about is around the need for a wealth tax and taxing wealth more. I think progressive tax reform can really be seen as a way of advancing all forms of justice and equality, whether that's climate and racial justice, gender equality to disability rights. And it provides a really clear answer to the often asked question when you're talking about these issues of how can we afford it? How are we going to make that happen? Or how can we pay for it? And I think this feels especially important right now. We know that people up and down the UK are struggling with, after 14 years of austerity, leaving our public services in ruins, with an ongoing cost of living crisis that's left record numbers of people reliant on food aid. And unsurprisingly, this leaves many people looking for something or someone to blame. And as we've seen really frighteningly in the news this week, increasing numbers of people turning to the far right for answers. We've seen a resurgence of racist anti-migrant violence on the rise again, and a government that frankly seems more interested in pandering to reform and threatening to take away support from the most marginalised instead of providing real, hopeful alternatives. And we'll hear more about this afterwards, I'm sure, but we know that inequality is also soaring, and as it stands right now, less than 50 families own more than 30 million people in the UK, and globally, the richest 1% own more than 95% of that. So the work that we do at Tax Justice UK, along with our partners in the movement, is about showing that this inequality and that is growing and on the rise is not just some inevitability how the system has to work. It's how the system is currently designed to work, and taxing wealth more can help build a fairer system and a more equal society. And as many people here, I'm sure, will know, our economic system is rigged in favour of the super rich, which helps them get richer at a faster rate than everyone else. And that fuels this inequality. So we know that it's billionaires, it's tech giants, and oil and gas companies profiting off the system, and the politicians who enable them who are to blame, not migrants living in hotels or disabled people who need social security to help them live their daily lives. So thinking a bit more about that system and how it's rigged, particularly the tax system, I would say that at home, this looks like a really unfair, outdated tax system with hundreds of loopholes, which the rich and powerful, with help from their tax advisors, can exploit to help them avoid paying the right amount of tax. And more broadly, which taxes ordinary people making a living from work at a much higher rate than people whose wealth is often inherited or held in passive assets like property or stocks and shares. So, as an example of this, which we often use, and you might have heard before, but previous Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, who belongs to one of the UK's 350 richest families, paid the same effective tax rate as a teacher in 2023, despite having over 50 times more wealth. That's in part because capital gains are taxed at around half the rate as income from work, which we don't think is right. That's also another reason why landlords making their income from renting out property are often paying a lower rate of tax than tenants who make their income from work. And overseas, if we look at secrecy mechanisms which make it easy for the very richest to hide their money in tax havens like the UK's overseas territories, this upholds ongoing extraction from formerly colonized countries and people, and again makes it easier for the super rich to hoard their wealth instead of that revenue going into the UK society and societies overseas. So the work that we're doing and that we've been doing over the past few years is about showing that it really doesn't have to be this way. The UK is the sixth richest country in the world. I think at the last count, we had around 160 billionaires. So there is more than enough money to ensure that all our communities can thrive. It doesn't have to just be held in the hands of the elite few. So, to ensure that wealth is spread more equally across society, at home we need to tax wealth more, both to rebalance the tax system in terms of how it treats income from work and wealth. So this would raise billions in investment for the UK in the shorter term, and then in the longer term, it would really tackle that inequality and make sure that wealth is redistributed more equitably across society. Um, Now we're up against a lot. There is a small but very loud and powerful number of people and vested interest groups, aka the wealth lobby, who hold a lot of influence over our media and politicians, and too often have the ear of government ministers and other decision makers. But what's been amazing to see in the time that I've been working at Tax Justice over the last year, especially, is that the campaign and the movement for a wealth tax and for taxing wealth more has grown hugely in momentum. So you might have heard some of the recent polling, but we heard in the last few months that 75% of the UK public, including a majority of reform voters, support bringing in a wealth tax as a way to fund public services and support our communities. We've heard unions like the NEU and TUC come out in favour of a wealth tax to raise vital revenue to support workers. And millionaires themselves, who you'll hear more about from Beck soon, are coming together and asking the government to tax them more to build an economy and a society in which everyone could have the same opportunities that they have. And just last month, over 30 of the world's leading economists joined calls for a wealth tax as a way to redistribute wealth and tackle soaring inequality. So it's been amazing to see this range of voices and people and movements come together and make this call. I think the welfare cuts crisis or moment, whatever you want to call it, in May was a real crunch point. And we saw a growing number of sort of soft, moderate left MPs, centre left MPs, say, come on board with this, or at least show curiosity and interest in the idea of a wealth tax as an alternative to cuts. And it allowed us to show that public sector cuts in the UK are always an unnecessary political choice and that there are real workable alternatives on the table here. So the barrier here, as we see it, is one of political will. And the government really needs to understand that unless people feel a genuine improvement to their quality of life, which could be brought about by taxing wealth more and creating revenue through that, then there's no chance they'll win the next election, and we're likely to see a move further to the right. So instead of fanning the flames of far right narratives and violence, taxing wealth more would be a better place to start, in our view. In terms of specific policies, we're calling for, along with our partners at Patriotic Millionaires, um, the introduction of a 2% annual wealth tax on the very richest. So we've set that threshold as people who have wealth of over 10 million. Any amount over that amount would be taxed at 2%. And this would raise £24 billion a year at least, which is more than 4 times what the government was considering taking from disability social security earlier this year. And it would only impact around 20,000 people, which, to put into context, is about the size of the O2 Arena. So it's a relatively small number of people, but with a huge impact. But that would make it easier for HMRC to administer. And it would, yeah, as we say, kind of help us build the kind of society that we want to see in the longer term. So I think the moment we're in and the challenge that we're up against is really showing the government that this is something that the public are behind and support, and that it is a voting issue that politicians have to get behind, show boldness, and really support if they want to keep their seats, if they want to win over constituents, and if they want to come up against the threat of reform, which many of them acknowledge and see, but maybe don't see the ways to go about challenging that. And I think especially in recent weeks, even, that we've seen with the emergence of this new left party, although yet remains to be seen what form that will take, and more recently with the Zach Blansky winning the Green leadership contest, there is real space to push for bold economic reform if the political will is there. Anyway, I'll stop there and pass over because I'm sure, yeah, let the other speakers go. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Caitlin. Thanks to your very clear policy of 2% on those who have over £10 million. Looking forward to the 3 other policies we're going to get from our other speakers. So I'm going to hand over to Bex, Rebecca.
Yeah, I'm not sure you get 3 other policies. I am somebody who is going to roundly support what Caitlin says and maybe a little more. Yes, as Caitlin said, I lead the work for Patriotic Millionaires, both internationally and in the UK. And I think more importantly for me, I have the great privilege and honour of being part of this economic change movement, which is completely transformative. And the conversation on tax specifically, which is what I want to talk about first, has changed seismically in the last 4 years. So it's a great privilege to be here, to be talking about it and to be a part of it. If I had to pick one immediate policy that I would like to see for the budget, it would be a 2% tax on those with 10 million or more, a 2% wealth tax. It is the sole tax, I believe, that will address or redress inequality beyond other tax policies that we also highlight need to change in order to tax the very richest at a greater extent. So I want to talk a little bit about tax, and then I'll talk about inequality in the round, if that's all right, and how it relates to tax policy, to work and to income as well, to an extent. But first on tax, and starting with positives, as Caitlin said, the narrative on this has shifted massively. The public is hugely supportive of taxing wealth more progressively. 75% of the public support a 2% tax on 10 million plus. We polled our members, sorry, no, not our members, we polled UK millionaires. Hopefully the polling of members will be higher, but UK millionaires were polled in May this year, and we found that 80% of UK millionaires support a 2% tax on wealth. How millionaires, the percentage of support is higher from millionaires than the public, I'm not really sure, but it certainly seems to be. These are really positive UK movements, and politically as well. I really want to stress that there has been some important advances globally in the course of the last year. The G20 committed to cooperating together on how to tax high net worth individuals last year. There has been continued conversation about through the course of 2025. So there is political movement, albeit it's been stymied by the advent of Trump under the Friends, similar Friends like that, but we have movement. Onto the negative and onto the more kind of UK focused aspect, not just UK, it's global trend. We have to transform tax policy. It takes so much from work and consumption and so little from wealth. Whereas in this country, we have 63% of our tax take is from income tax, from national insurance, from VAT. And only 4% comes from capital and wealth, so shares, assets, stuff like that. So 4 pence in the pound is from capital, whereas most of it comes from our work. So this huge imbalance and this huge onus on working people and the poorest people to pick up the pieces of a broken economy. With like the poorest 10%, I think their effective tax rate is twice what the richest 0.01% is. So the tax system really does need a complete overhaul if we are going to make it fair. And it's not just about the policies that I'm sure some of you have seen floated recently in the last kind of month or so from the government on property, although there is some positives to be seen in that. There are more policies that need to be addressed, and we, between Patriotic Millionaires and Tax Justice UK, we've got a kind of raft of 10 policies that they should be looking at to change, which would raise about £60 billion to make the tax system fairer and also to simplify it, which is essential. The key policy though really is to tackle inequality is a wealth tax. It is the most obvious and the most straightforward one to tackle the very richest in this country, which is absolutely what we need to do, because the trend in policy making and setting over the course of the last 50 years, 40 years, has certainly been to deepen inequality. Fiscal policy has deepened inequality to a large extent, and we see how tax policy has shifted to aggravate that. Even the most recent examples of tax policy in this country are the freezing of tax thresholds, which has dragged ordinary people into higher tax brackets, whilst we've seen kind of tiny baby steps into how we tax wealth more effectively. The abolition of the non-dom status, which we had so much noise about, and it's been so difficult to pass through. These taxes on the very richest really are difficult to push through and are against the grain of the last few decades. Whereas even just on income, the top rate of tax on income in the mid-1970s was like 70-ish% across OECD countries. Now what we have is at least half of that. Well, it's been halved by about 2013. So the trend is really to reduce taxes on the very rich as well, increasing them even in a clandestine way on ordinary people. And that's reflected as well in work. So, we've seen real terms wage increases of £16 between 2010 and 2024, whilst FTSE 100 CEOs are making an average of 4.5 million now and are paid 122 times what the average worker in the UK is paid. So it's not just about the individuals and how they prosper or how the small few individuals prosper. It is about how all these policies affect our country at large. The country suffers because fiscal policy is imbalanced. While we have kind of few people really prospering, we have various services and care that we need to provide. So care, so health, social, travel, education, all of the things that all of us require, irrespective of our socioeconomic background, are suffering because the promise and the prosperity of the country is drained out of the public purse and put into a private purse. So whilst the wealth of the public wealth of the UK in 1989 was 360 billion, the public wealth of our country last year was down to minus $1 trillion. That's all while we have kind of this increasing number of billionaires in the UK. And as Caitlin said, about 40 families have the same wealth as the bottom half of the country. So there's a huge imbalance. It needs to be addressed, and taxing wealth is a vital part of doing that. And a wealth tax is at the vanguard of the policy changes that we need to see. I really want to talk for a minute though, or a couple of minutes, about a policy tool that I would like to introduce to this conversation that goes beyond tax and focuses a little bit more on inequality in the round, which is our mission is to work against the destabilising impacts of economic inequality. And as a habit, what we've done globally and at the national level is to focus the impact of inequality on the poorest people. We don't focus on wealth very effectively beyond kind of a handful of campaigning groups and certain bits of research, although that is changing. And I think that's best reflected in the fact that the way we measure poverty, the metrics that we use, the metrics we employ, focus on poverty and don't really focus on wealth. That's best reflected in the fact that globally we have an extreme poverty line to understand the point at which poverty becomes terribly harmful. We also have our kind of national assessment of poverty lines in this country and countries around the world. But we recognise that poverty is not siloed. It does not operate in and of itself by itself. It belongs to a much broader, wider list of themes and issues that relate to society at large. And I think we understand that better. We certainly understand that better from the work done in 2009, from the Spirit level, from Wilkinson and Pickett, and work beyond that. Knowing that inequality is has a huge impact on poverty, we also should know that inequality has a relationship with wealth, and extreme wealth is costing us in a way that we are increasingly understanding, but we don't fully appreciate. So we've done some work over the course of the last year on the harms of extreme wealth beyond poverty, looking at the risks to democracy, the risks to the economy, to our media landscape, to our legal landscape, and the risk to social cohesion at large. And looking at how really the influence and the power of extreme wealth and the capture that it has is undermining what we all value. The pillars of our societies are being undermined by extreme wealth. And if we care about extreme wealth, we care about inequality, we care about poverty, and we have metrics to identify where poverty starts to be really harmful, why don't we have a metric to understand where extreme wealth becomes really harmful? If we understand the floor, why don't we understand the ceiling? And the critical reason for that is because we all have a different interpretation of what extreme wealth is. My argument is that we need a policy tool that allows us to set a metric for understanding extreme wealth, to draw a line and to develop a number that allows people to understand, like a really, really tangible tool to understand extreme wealth is harmful and this is the point at which it becomes harmful. And if we do that, we not only have the metric that can be helpful for policymakers and policy designers to say, okay, well, we need to introduce a wealth tax at this point, at this threshold or at this rate, because this is a point that's identified where we appreciate extreme wealth is harmful. Or, for example, in political capture, we need to set a line for political donations or caps at this point from these kind of donors, because this is the point at which extreme wealth is harmful. I believe a metric that understands extreme wealth and sets a complete new frame around the fact that extreme wealth is harmful can be used by policymakers as a policy procedural tool to influence not just tax, but a whole range of economic issues. And we should be getting on with the job of doing that now. In the next 10 years, but the job of the Parliament, this Parliament, and the job of this budget to bring it back to the beginning is to deliver that wealth tax, as soon as we can. So 2 things from me.
Thank you so much. That's really helpful, clear. So for those that just joined, we've already heard from Rebecca for Patriotic Millionaires and Caitlin from Tax Justice UK. And the 2 clear policies are around 2% tax on those with over 10 million and the need for an extreme wealth line. And now I'm going to hand over to Sarah Rees from Women's Budget Group.
Thank you very much, Fran. And I would very much like to continue with the conversation about tax. And what I would like to do with my contribution is to include some reflections on the gender aspect of not just wealth tax and tax in general, but also the other 2 elements of today's talk, work and incomes as well. So what we argue at the Women's Budget Group is that all of these things are gender. They have a gender element, and that element is important to consider to ensure that policymaking is effective. And I think, the gender element of some of these things might be more obvious in some of them than in others. So for instance, on incomes, we're all familiar with the gender pay gap. Tax might not be as straightforward to analyze from a gender perspective. But we see our role at WBG as to teasing out the ways in which gender norms, gender relations shape people's economic circumstances, and also how they shape the economy. So fundamentally, it all comes back to the fact that our economic policy, our economic systems are very much focused still on productive work. So work that happens in the formal economy and which is remunerated usually. So productive work is valued over reproductive labor, or as we often call it, care work. And this is the work that goes into feeding people, clothing them, keeping our homes warm, clean, educating the next generation, raising it, and so on, supporting people who are ill or disabled or elderly. So making sure that they all achieve and maintain a good quality of life. So this is a type of work that's invisible, it's undervalued in our society and in our economy, but it effectively underpins our society and it underpins our economies as well. And most of this work, reproductive work, care work, takes place within families. It's still done primarily by women, and while it's valuable and while, as I said, it does underpin our economies, our society, it also has a cost to the people who perform it. We argue that it's actually the fact that this type of work is unevenly distributed at the moment is what's behind women's economic disadvantage and many of the the headline gender gaps that we all hear about. So because care work is still primarily the responsibility of women, it restricts women's ability to engage in the labor market, go for better paid jobs that might have longer hours or be more inflexible or demand a longer commute. And this effectively leads to occupational segregation and with women effectively concentrated in lower paid occupations. But then there's also notions about what sorts of jobs women and men are better suited to do. And this also leads to sectoral segregation. And so, for instance, care work, even when it's done in the formal economy, these sorts of careers are undervalued because effectively it's feminized work. It's work that women often do for free. So therefore, it's very often considered low skilled, and then it's also low paid. These segregations contribute to the gender pay gap, and as is, I think, widely known, the gender pay gap actually opens up around the mid-30s, 40s age group, which is when women become mothers, and the disparity on who takes on care responsibilities really takes off. And I suppose the restrictions on women's careers become very strong, and then we see really that disparity on earnings and pay. So gender pay gap, lower earnings mean that then for women it's harder to accumulate savings, wealth, and pensions as well later on in life. And these gaps, the gender wealth gap and the gender pension gap, are even wider than the gender pay gap. And so this all means that women face a more disadvantaged economic position in general, which makes them more dependent on public goods. Things like social security. Women are the main beneficiaries of social security. They also rely to a larger extent on public services like social housing, childcare, healthcare, and so on. And this is actually in three ways. They they rely more on public services as direct users, but also as workers in these sectors. If we think about healthcare, if we think about childcare and social care, all of these sectors are the vast majority of the workers are women. And then also as the supporters of last resort when these public services fail or just aren't there or fall short. And this was really what we've seen in the last well, in the 14 years or so that austerity was implemented, that women lost more of their living standards during austerity than men. So we did some analysis last year that in which we calculated that women lost on average 9.4% of their living standards during austerity, compared to men losing 5.8%, so nearly half. Which brings us to the tax conversation. And at the Women's Budget Group, we often say that tax is a feminist issue because it has different implications for women and men. And decisions about tax design, about who is eligible to pay tax thresholds at which different tax bands are set, rates and so on, which taxes should do the heavy lifting in raising revenue, for instance. All of these things have implications for equality, including gender equality. So I think it's very clear on how there are implications on tax for class equality, but there's also implications for gender equality. And this is mostly for two reasons. There are gender gaps in income, both from employment and from passive sources like assets. And there are particularly large gaps when it comes to wealth, meaning that when you target these things with taxes in a progressive way, you're also narrowing gender inequalities. This is especially true for wealth taxes, because the gender gap in wealth is wider than for income, or for pay even. So the gender gap is 21% for all wealth, whereas it's 13% for the gender pay gap. But it's even wider when we look at pension wealth, 43%, or there's a gap of 43% when it comes to pensions between women and men. Interestingly, the type of wealth that women and men hold is also different. So most of women's wealth is property wealth. So basically, usually their residence, which more often than not is also shared with others. Whereas men's primary source of wealth, it's actually pensions, which I think is also very interesting and also brings up, I think, considerations around wealth taxation. And then, so this is one reason, the fact women have less wealth than men. But then you also have the fact that if women disproportionately benefit from the things that tax funds, then if you have more tax revenues, then you can invest in those things that are better for everyone, but in particular for women. So we think that taxing wealth and other forms of progressive taxation, such as the ones that Caitlin and Rebecca have talked about, is really a no-brainer when it comes to achieving gender equality. So I just wanted to finalize with a reflection on what this means for policymaking, and which also brings me to the sorts of policies that we would like to see and that we would argue for. If we want to create workplaces that are more inclusive, if we want to close gender gaps in our economy, improve women's economic and financial circumstances, we need to tackle that root cause of it. So the undervaluation of care work in our economy, both when it's done within families and when it's done in the formal economy. So we need better paying conditions to workers, in particularly in those the care sectors. We need stronger protections. All of these things are being addressed as well in the employment rights bill. So we really want the government to continue building on that good work fair pay agreements in the social care sector, and extending it to similar sectors like childcare as well, flexible working as default, all of these things, and then also a parental leave system that offers fathers better options for caring for their children from the very start, because we know that that sets the tone for their involvement in child rearing and in care more broadly, and then that leads to a more equal distribution of this type of work between women and men. So to summarize, invest in public services that support this care work, reproductive work, and which we argue are effectively a type of infrastructure that underpin our economy, and to raise money for that, wealth taxes.
Thanks, Sarah. And another one for wealth taxes, but also you brought in a whole swathe of other policies that need to be looked at. I'm going to hand over to our final speaker, Alfie.
Thanks, Fran. Thanks, Autonomy. Really good to be part of this conversation. Yeah, so incomes work. I mean, I think that for me at least, any conversation about incomes at the present moment has sort of three facts that sort of ring about in the back of my head. I think it's always worth starting with. The first of those facts is that if you take the latest OBR forecast, that's the Office of Budget Responsibility, the government's official forecaster for the economy, and their most recent ones from the spring, and you look at what that means for actual families, for their disposable income after housing costs in this country, then you see that consistent with those forecasts, the average family will be about £200 worse off next year, more than £700 worse off by the end of the Parliament, and £1,000 worse off by the end of the decade. Now that's in the government's own forecasts, and we're doing some work at the moment that shows that it looks like that picture could be, that picture is not improving at the moment. The second fact is that within that picture of the average household and their income, their disposable income after housing costs falling, is a rising inequality, a growing inequality. And you've got the poorest third of households seeing their disposable income fall twice as fast as the middle or the top. And the third fact is that if this comes to pass, and this is, as I say, this is a forecast, it's dependent on a number of things taking place, but it is the current forecast the government is going by. If this comes to pass, it would mean it's the first Parliament on modern record where the average family has lower income by the end of the Parliament than they did at the start. And various other colleagues on the panel have talked about the political implications of this, the rise of the far right. And I think it goes without saying that a situation where you have the first Parliament on record where people's incomes decline may not be a survivable record for any government to defend. So I thought to just talk a little bit about what some of the drivers of that might be, and then offer some thoughts on policy. So on drivers, there are just some immediate things in the data. So we know that the two main drivers of that picture, of that outlook for disposable incomes, are firstly really weak real wage growth. And that's driven essentially by a slowing down in the economy, slowing down in large part because of a really restrictive interest rate environment, high elevated interest rates as part of a monetary policy stance to control inflation, to try and bring inflation down. But of course, it does that by pushing down on wages, pushing down on employment, because it's taking out consumption and demand out of the economy. People are paying more for credit and therefore spending less on consumption and investment. So that's the first thing. We have a really notable drop-off in real earnings, both in mortgages with sort of direct pass-through from higher interest rates, but also on rents as well, particularly in the private rented sector. And those two elements are the key features that are driving that real squeeze on disposable incomes. And then within that, in terms of this picture of inequality, the reason why you have lower income families faring worse than the middle or the top is partly because it tends to be the case that when you have a slowdown in earnings, when you have a drop off in employment as a result of a sluggish economy, it tends to be those jobs that are lower paid, that are more precarious, less secure, that tend to feel the brunt of that. You have wage restraint in those parts of the workforce. You have job losses are more likely in that part of the workforce. It's also because housing costs are a bigger share of low-income families' income overall. They hit harder proportionally on their household budgets. And the third is there are elements of the safety net of the social security system for which lower income households, whether in or out of work, many working low income households receive in-work financial support through the benefit system. But those households, the elements of that system of universal credit are capped in nominal terms, so they don't rise with inflation. So things like local housing allowance that supports people in the private rental sector, things like the benefit cap in universal credit prevents income support from rising with inflation in many instances. So what does all this mean for policy? I think that it's worth acknowledging that I think part of the right policy response is what government is trying to do. I think part of what they're doing is partly right. And that includes this focus on the supply side of the economy, trying to improve productivity, trying to ensure that we can produce more for the amount of inputs that we have in the economy. So that includes things like higher public investment, higher private investment as well, being crowded in, active labour market interventions to try and support people into work, to strengthen worker rights. And also in terms of planning and housing supply, this sort of, if you like, constellation of what you might describe as supply side measures are, I think are helpful, and they're one of the important steps. But I think there are two potentially quite large oversights in the government response that is relying quite heavily on that narrow supply side focus. Through investment and planning regulation. So the first is that it is possible, if not probable, that the economy at the moment is significantly demand constrained. And by that I mean families are unable to get the economy moving through their spending because they simply don't have the disposable income to do that. And to some extent, that risks a response where you're just trying to increase how much we produce as your response to stagnation. It risks sort of pushing on a piece of string and trying to get the economy moving, because in the end, it doesn't matter how much we can improve productivity or improve our potential output. If families haven't got the money to afford it, then we're not going to see a recovery. And there are several reasons to believe why this might be the case. We know that before the pandemic, we had stagnating demand for more than a decade, and it was deteriorating year on year. And there's no real reason to believe that the mechanics of that, which we know are aging population in particular, have waned. And in fact, we know that population aging has accelerated through the 2020s, and that perhaps the reason why government doesn't focus on it, perhaps the reason why much of the economic commentariat don't focus on the demand side, is because we've had a pandemic, we had a cost of living shock, inflation was the immediate issue, and the kind of, if you like, temporary effects from those shocks have concealed these deeper structural forces that are now kind of coming back into the fore in the latter half of the 2020s. The second is that we see a lot of evidence of demand deficiency at the moment. Real earnings actually haven't risen for 8 months. It hasn't come into the news quite yet because the official rate of earnings growth is always on an annualized basis. But actually, if you look at the within year data, all the earnings growth this year essentially happened in the first 4 months, and we've had barely any real earnings growth since September. But there are a number of other things as well. Vacancy rates in the labour markets have dropped right off. The savings rate in the UK is higher than any point it was in the 2010s. So people are saving, not spending, and that's again partly from an aging population, anticipation of a longer retirement, and relatively weak safety net in retirement, but also people feeling that precarity of the recent years and not feeling confident that there is an insurance system for them other than their own means and their own savings. The second oversight is that it tends to be the case that government thinks of living standards and economic security for households as a nice and desirable outcome from a strong economy, as opposed to a really important input to a strong economy. And so as a result of that, we tend to see the government focusing on direct support for living standards thinking very little about direct support for living standards as part of their growth strategy, and more thinking about living standards as something that they get as a byproduct or as a desirable outcome from sorting out the economy first. But we know from the literature that actually supporting household economic insecurities, increasing living standards, strengthens the economy overall as well. We know that workers are more likely to be productive at work if they have security at home. We know that people are more likely to invest, to take a risk, to start a business or invest in their own skills if if they feel secure and have decent living standards. We know that stronger unemployment support creates pressure for higher quality work as well, and improves the matching of workers and quality jobs. So that we know that making living standards a part of your inputs to a strong economy has lots of beneficial outcomes, but it tends not to be focused on in terms of the government's current approach. So to get then much more specific about what specific policy initiatives might help address this, I think there are essentially sort of three buckets that you can think about, and they all pertain to government intervening directly to support living standards, both to address this potential demand side problem, giving families the resources to be able to spend on the things that they need, but also increasing household economic insecurity to ensure families can contribute through the workplace, through investment, through developing their skills. And the three buckets are what you might call cross-market interventions. And this is cross-market interventions. The second is within market interventions, and the third is the tax system. Cross-market is where government essentially is using fiscal transfers, public spending, to move resources from one part of the economy to another. So it might be taxation and then subsidy, or taxation and income support somewhere. Within market is where you have an existing enclosed market like utilities or housing, and the government intervenes directly in that market to see a redistribution between either the sort of producers and consumers, so the providers of a service or goods and the consumers, or consumers to consumers in terms of high and low income or high and low consumption. And the third is tax, in terms of both raising the revenue for public subsidy and support, but also to increase efforts to in order to reduce inequality and make the tax system more growth supporting as well, in terms of its neutrality and stability. So maybe just to get very quickly then give three specific policies. The first within a cross-market bucket for us would be strengthening the social security system, and specifically coming in with two main changes. The first would be to legislate for a minimum floor in the means safety net, beneath which nobody can fall, and that becomes a legal requirement. So you'd have to reform the benefit cap, you'd have to reform the deductions regime, sanctions, etc. They would no longer be able to operate beneath a legalized minimum floor that no one could fall below. And the second would be to ensure that minimum floor is set at a level that is commensurate with what people actually need. So you might think of it in terms of like a basket of essentials that people need to be able to afford, in terms of housing, housing costs, energy, and other sorts of essentials, transport, etc. And that would imply, we think on our calculations, around at least a £30 a week increase in the standard rate of universal credit. The second, in terms of within market intervention, I think there are lots of things here you could think about, whether it's the private renter sector, whether it's about different utilities. But one example I would give is the idea of intervening in the retail energy market to reduce energy bills for households particularly with low income and with lower consumption. And the idea is that you would replace the Ofgem energy price cap with a scheme that said, actually, we're going to have two price caps in effect. One where everyone pays a subsidized unit price on all their energy consumption up to, say, an essentials level. So everyone in the country has a subsidized if you like, amount of energy that they can consume. And then above that threshold, you have a premium charged. So people pay a higher than the market rate above that threshold. And then you bring in things like protections for households on
don't have Western music like that. So
Oh, sorry, I think I was muted there.
That was my fault. I think there was someone who was admitted accidentally with a microphone,
No
and I
problem.
accidentally muted you, Alfie. Apologies.
No problem. I'll wrap up. So you have a higher price above a certain threshold, a lower price beneath it, and you ensure that families on means-tested benefits only ever pay the lower price. You can ensure that households which are larger, have more children, can have a higher allowance as well. But you're effectively redistributing from higher income, higher consuming energy households to lower income households. And you can also find ways to fund that through levies on energy producers as well. And then the third, in the tax space, I think the place that we would look first, I agree with many of the comments made by colleagues previously in terms of the sort of the broad agenda on tax. I think we would focus particularly on this issue around the lack of neutrality in tax treatment of income from different sources. So the fact that this idea that, a landlord will often pay lower taxes on their rental income than the tenants will pay on their labour earnings living in that same house. And I think therefore we need to look at interventions that will try and normalise and equalise the effective tax rate on income irrespective of its source. And that means looking at things like the tax base for NICs. Can that be applied to a broader set of incomes beyond just labour earnings, thinking about rental income, thinking about savings, thinking about dividends, and really expanding that tax base for NICs. And also looking at things like capital gains tax, both in terms of the rate, and can that rate be equalised with income tax, perhaps with deductions allowance to take account of reasonable returns on investment. And there are lots of things within the capital gains tax base that really need fixing as well, in terms of different reliefs and perverse incentives that are not commensurate with genuinely productive economic activity. So I'll finish there, but those would be my three examples of three policy ideas across three different types of intervention.
Great, thanks, Alfie. And sorry that my internet cut me off for a little bit, but I got back and heard most of what you said, which was really useful. So thank you to all of our speakers. We've heard a lot of great policies, and really appreciate those last three from you, Alfie, on energy costs, the minimum floor, and neutrality, and the fact that there's a lot of work to do to actually shift away from just taxing income to taxing wealth and assets and land as an asset, and also the extreme wealth line, the 2% on the 10 million, and thinking about how we value care work as well. That was really helpful from Sarah. So before we open it up, I'm just going to ask one question from using my chair privileges. I might ask another one later on, but I guess, the momentum on the wealth tax is increasing, and, there are a lot of Labour MPs that are softening towards it, the more centre-left ones, and civil society seems to be kind of coalescing around wanting to push this. I guess when I've kind of pushed people on why it can't be implemented, there's always the fear of the bond markets, and that, already borrowing is really high. We've seen it just hit its 27-year high this week, and that if Rachel Reeves was to implement a wealth tax, the kind of financial sector would come after her. Obviously, if that is the case, it's a question mark over whether we live in a democracy and what can be done. But it'd be great to hear the panel's kind of thoughts about this situation that Labour seems to have found themselves in with the financial markets, and whether anyone's got any thoughts. And a wealth tax. Becca, it'd be great to go to you first.
What is risk, right? What risk do you want to take? Because right now, if you freeze thresholds or you increase taxes on working people and ordinary people more, the risk that you face is you push the entire country into the arms of Nigel Farage, right? So, of course, there may well be a risk that we see some capital flight and, the market might respond. That risk, there isn't actually the evidence that you will see capital flight, although there's a lot of noise of that from the wealth defence industry. There is absolute evidence that we are drifting towards the people in this country feeling like they cannot cope anymore, they aren't listened to, they are not represented, and therefore they will go for the most popular person who says, I'll fix it for you. And to me, our politicians need to stop considering what might happen and the threat of a projection and look at what is happening, and then consider policies that will benefit most people rather than a few people. That's my assessment. Like, I throw it back. The risks, there are multiple risks, and one of them is very, very real.
Yeah, brilliant answer. Does any other speaker want to come in on that? Otherwise, I'm going to open it up to the wider audience. Okay.
I mean, I would kind of unsurprisingly echo that. I think it's a question of, we're in a situation where it's, I guess, looking at trade-offs and what the different options are. And I think, just echoing what Bex has said, but there is very real and ongoing risk that millions of people across this country are already facing. And I think that it's a question of what is the risk if there's no action. And I think, as we've seen from countless polls, from public doing research with members of the public and across the board, it's people saying we need real, genuine change. And these are the people who will make the difference between whether we get a reform government or not at the next election. And more importantly, in terms of whether people will feel a genuine improvement to their quality of lives. And as it stands, more and more people living in poverty than we've seen in a long time, including children, as we've seen in the government's poverty strategy. So I think, there will be risks and consequences of any tax change that's introduced, and there will always be groups who push back and say this isn't what we want to see and this is going to affect us badly. But I think it's taking a step back and looking at society as a whole, and looking at what is needed to bring about real transformative change. And I think that is not a question of taxing ordinary people more, or fearing too much what might happen if we upset the very wealthiest, and being a bit bolder in what we change.
Thank you. That's really helpful. It would be great to see some hands. You can kind of wave at me or put your hand up using the Zoom React, so I can see who would like to ask a question to the panel. Jeremy Gilbert, I'm going to come to you. We can't see you, but I can see your hand.
Hang on, can you hear me?
Yes.
Ben Ansell has this article in Prospect today, written for the fairly centrist audience of Prospect, but it's sort of gently making the case for the desirability of some sort of a left populist program. But he's arguing there, as I've heard quite a few people argue recently, the wealth tax isn't, even at its best, a wealth tax isn't going to generate enough income to fund that kind of social democratic program that could really meet the kind of level of demand in society now. That you would have to have some sort of increases in income tax across the board. So he's also arguing that it's, ultimately all the polling evidence is income tax has more sort of moral legitimacy even when it's raised. I'm not arguing for that at all. But I'm interested in what the panel think about it.
Okay, who wants to take that one? What else needs to be raised, and is income tax rises inevitable?
I'm happy to come in, but appreciate I just spoke, so others please do come in. But I think I mean, for this panel, I guess we were asked to come up with one policy if we had to choose it, and a wealth tax is what we're predominantly pushing for and calling for. But this does obviously come alongside a whole suite of other policy proposals that we in Patriotic Millionaires UK have put forward, that would take steps to tax wealth more in a myriad of ways, a wealth tax being one of them. But we have I'll share it in the chat, but we have a policy paper outlining 10 tax reforms that would raise over 60 billion a year, all of them taking steps to equalise how the tax system treats income from wealth and work. And I think the question of is raising income tax inevitable? It's one of sequencing. Like the point is also a moral one, that for too long, income from work has been taxed at a much higher rate than income from wealth. And so if we're going to make changes, that's where we want to see them first, before we start kind of conversations about whether there needs to be a rise on income tax. especially given the context we're in of a cost of living crisis and increasing numbers of people dependent on food aid. So I think it's one of sequencing, and it's one of morality, really, would be my take on that.
Can
Okay,
I add
and
something
Sarah, do you want to come in? Yeah.
to that? I think it's also I think part of the momentum on behind wealth taxes might have come also from the fact that the Chancellor has tied her hands in saying that this government will definitely not raise taxes on income, VAT. I think those were the two, or NICs on for employees. So effectively, that leaves very little room in terms of what else can be raised when it comes to taxes. So I think that also plays into this conversation.
Rebecca, do you want to come in on this
I
question?
wanted to ask a question back. Jeremy, did you say that the piece argues for there is a greater level of morality in raising income tax than in introducing?
It's not making an ethical argument on its own terms. It's citing polling evidence that the wealth tax is that people don't think a wealth tax is as morally legitimate as income tax. I'm not defending it. No, I'm not defending it. I'm just saying that's what he's putting out there.
I mean, to me, the provocation on income tax, and I don't know what I think about this, but the provocation is, should we have a cost of living tax exemption, right? So should you be able to make enough money to live well, or to live before you pay any tax at all? And that to me is like that's an alternative proposition, and I'm not sure that it's right or wrong, but I certainly think that there's an interesting argument to be had that actually the poorest workers in this country who are paying income tax currently deserve to have that question asked for themselves. You know, why should I be paying tax if I can't even survive on my wage? So I can't really understand. I'd love to see the polling, yes please, because I can't understand the moral case for wanting to prioritise tax and income over wealth.
Yeah, I think we're all agreed on that front. Okay, we'll come to John. John Easy's raised his hand, and then I'll come back to the panel.
Yeah, well, I mean, taxing the wealthy is an obvious and as a given for all of us, I think. But an actual direct wealth tax is extremely difficult to actually impose. I mean, I'd like to hear the supporters of a direct wealth tax explain how HMRC are going to value the wealth of every person in this country. At the moment, they don't know how many billionaires there are. And it's extremely complex to do that. Just another point, I very much appreciate Alfie's suggestions.
Great. Thanks, John. I'm sure that Caitlin might have thought about implementation of the wealth tax. I might go to her first, if that's okay, and then other panelists can chime in after.
Yeah, it's a really important question, and just to say, agree that currently HMRC, it's really concerning that, as you say, they don't know how many super rich people live in this country. So the first thing we would be saying is they need to re-establish the unit that they disbanded in 2017, which examined and collected tax from the super rich, not just what they currently have, which is defined as the wealthy, which is set at a much lower threshold and therefore much harder to administer. So, yeah, we're not denying that there are design changes that would need to be implemented within HMRC. And that's why one of the things that we're calling for alongside of this is better resourcing for HMRC to be able to do this work properly. And we have some of the best expert minds in the country thinking about how this can be done. So one of the ways, I mean, it wouldn't necessarily be something we have done so in such a broad scale way, but there are ways to value assets, and Centax, the Centre for Tax Reform, have a really great paper outlining exactly the how a wealth tax could be administered in a similar way to inheritance tax. And I think an important point, and why we call for this threshold of 10 million, is that it would be a relatively small number of people, which would make it easier for HMRC to administer. And there's some really interesting research which the New Economics Foundation are doing at the moment, looking at what is the infrastructure that would be needed to make this happen in reality, because we need to get that off the ground in order to make this a reality within this parliament. But we have a document. There is that paper by Syntax, and then we have a document outlining the answers to this question in a bit more depth, which I can share after. But yeah, it's an important one, and it's something that we would say, yes, there are things that would need to change, but that's not a reason to stop pursuing it.
Thank you. Anyone else want to come in on any of the questions so far? Alfie, you haven't responded. Oh, John has also popped his hand up again. Do you want to have a quick response, John?
Yeah, I'm not suggesting it shouldn't be pursued. There's nothing wrong with pursuing it. I'm just suggesting that it would take a hell of a long time to actually implement. And there are other things we can do. Most of the things that are suggested by Alfie could be done more or less straight away, and also bring in a lot of income.
Can I respond?
Yeah, come in, Rebecca.
Yeah, totally agree. Everything that Alfie said should be done. That's absolutely right. Aaron Advani at Syntax says that to get the administration right on a wealth tax probably take about 3 years. So that's why in this budget this year, we need to make 2 to 3 years. We need to make sure that they are committed to delivering a wealth tax in this parliament, right? So you've got a couple of years of this government left to be able to deliver a wealth tax. What we need to do now if you want to raise revenue to fix the black hole or to invest in public services or whatever you want to do now, we should be doing things like Alfie suggested. We should be equalising capital gains with income, but we absolutely must deliver a wealth tax if we're serious about addressing inequality. Just got to be done. Otherwise, this is going to be a problem that we come back to again and again and again. Can't just be about revenue raising. It has to be about reducing the amount of wealth that is stuck in an unproductive way in the hands of a very, very few people.
Great. Thanks, Rebecca. And also Jeremy's written about Ansel also pointing out that property values for council tax haven't been appraised since 1991, which is not what a normal country does. So that's another avenue. I'm not sure how much that was covered in the housing panel, but obviously thinking about property and land taxation is a key part of the tax conversation. Feel free, if you don't want to raise your hand, to put a question in the chat as well. And yeah, is there any other kind of comments on what questions have been asked so far from the panel? Otherwise, I'm going to go to Will, who's got a question.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for a really interesting panel. It's going to be, yeah, I mean, it's quite a huge topic, but like all three things, tax work and incomes. I wondered if there was just any thoughts on income beyond wage labour, and I guess beyond the labour market. I know Sarah talked about this quite a lot, but I just wanted to. I'm interested to see what the panelists' position is on welfare reform. It's something I've talked to Alfie a lot for a long time, but I just wondered what that would look like in concrete terms, given that we all know that universal credit isn't fit for purpose. So just general thoughts on that as the kind of like other end of the system to the kind of the tax end. Thanks.
Great question. What about welfare reform? Alfie, do you want to give us your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, that was the first of the three sort of specific policy areas I spoke to. And I agree, it's really, really, really important. I mean, I think that you can, the two features of reform that I talked about are the two you'd want to prioritize in order to, fundamentally shift the effectiveness of universal credit as it currently stands. And as I said, those two are to make sure you have a genuine minimum floor that people can't go below. At the moment, that is full of holes because of the benefit cap, because of the deductions regime, because of sanctions. And you can tighten that, reduce it, set a floor that's eagerly instigated that means people cannot fall below that. And the second big problem with universal credit is the level of adequacy, the extent to which the support that is given is commensurate either with what people need to live or in fact where earnings are in terms of minimum wage are at the moment. In terms of that standard rate of universal credit, we have one of the weakest safety nets among advanced economies. Now that's partly because as a country we put a lot of money into housing costs. We have, and it comes back to the kind of our economic model of house price growth and rising house prices, which means we then spend a lot of money on the safety net part of housing. But the standard remuneration for insurance, if you like, for losing your job is the weakest one of the weakest on advanced economies. So I think it's a really big priority. It's really important. It's not just important from a redistributive inequality perspective. It's also, I think, could be part of a different type of active labour market approach. One where you're trying to create the sort of pressure for good jobs to be provided, where you're trying to value the match and that you support people into good work, not just any work. So it's also, I think, a really complementary policy agenda as part of a active labour market policy. And I think, yeah, and so I think I would think it's a big priority.
And how far is the conversation on this with like Labour or with certain parts of government or policy? Like, is this very fringe, or is this actually, like, there's obviously a recognition things aren't working. They've done some really bad things which they've had to U-turn on in the last 12 months, but has that taken folk or other organisations apart from JRF towards understanding there's some other solutions out there? That'll be my question back to you, Alfie.
So I think the government has a complicated relationship with social security. So clearly it was one of the first places that they turned to in the spring in order to save money, in order to go back to the question of the pressure they're getting on the fiscal rules on the on high rates on government debt. They turned very quickly to health-related benefits in particular to try and save money. And the thing that they really fell down on in the end was essentially they tried to make that an argument about helping people into work when it was quite clear it was actually about saving money, and that's why they were unable fundamentally, I think, to bring their party with them. But clearly that means they're in a place that we think is not a good place and certainly not the sort of reform agenda we're talking about. But the reason why I say it's complicated is because, number one, that has now clearly shifted. We do not anticipate them coming back to the social security system for savings this autumn. That is precisely why the debate is now much more around tax. I think within government it's less so around wealth tax in particular, but some of these other some of the other levers they might pull on a more immediate basis. Because I agree with everything that the panel has said in terms of just the sequencing of this. But the other reason why it's complicated is because actually what's interesting, and it got very little attention, is within the welfare reform bill. In fact, what ended up being one of the only surviving elements of it in terms of substantive spending terms was an increase in the standard allowance of universal credit at a faster rate of inflation. So we actually were increasing that standard allowance at a faster rate than inflation. But it's the first time in years, I think possibly the first time since universal credit came in that's happened, partly in recognition of the sort of arguments that I've been making alongside others. So there are risks and there are opportunities, I think, as we look to the rest of the Parliament.
Thank you. Anyone else want to kind of come in on looking at welfare reforms?
Yes,
Sarah?
I would like to add on the complicated relationship that this government seems to have with social security, the child poverty strategy, and this government's commitment to tackle child poverty. And I think in there is a genuine recognition that social security has a role to play in tackling child poverty, and particularly certain elements of it, like the 2-child limit and the benefit cap. But I think the question always that this government seems to stumble on is, how can we afford it? Or we can't afford it because we need to and so that's why I think having this conversation about the options that there are for revenue raising is important, and to show the myriad of ways that we can make our tax system more progressive, because then that shows that there is actually money to fund these things that will make an impact on tackling poverty and raising living standards, that will actually have an impact on people's lives, and also potentially then in the wider economy as people have growing spending powers.
Thank you. Are there any other questions from the audience? We're kind of wrapping up. Well, we've had a really good range of policies and rich conversation. So maybe I can just come back to oh, we've got one more that's popped in. I was going to go to final comments, but I'm going to assume Richard doesn't want to say it verbally, so I'm just going to share. In debates on welfare reform, much of the focus is still on affordability and paying for change. But if the UK government issues its own currency, should we rethink the role of tax, not as a way to fund welfare, but as a tool to reduce inequality, curb inflation, and build support for universal policies like a wealth tax or UBI? Yeah, pretty fundamental question. I could kind of speak to it from my previous role as running Positive Money, but maybe I'll let the panel go for it. I guess kind of, yeah, connected to that, there's been a bit of momentum this week around looking at the role that thinking about kind of quantitative easing and tiered reserves and potentially a windfall tax on banks could raise some funds and be kind of closing the loophole. So IPPR released a report that kind of has followed work from the New Economics Foundation, potentially when Alfie was there or maybe after. Positive Money has also done some work on this. So thinking through more kind of fundamental changes to the money and banking system, but also immediately closing some loopholes could raise quite a significant amount of money. To speak to Sarah's point, that's quite critical right now. It would be good to hear, yeah, if Alfie or others have got thoughts on that, and yeah, kind of more fundamental shifts in thinking, rethinking the role of tax, particularly as we need to, yeah, and bringing in the conversation that Rebecca brought around an extreme wealth line. Just gonna open it up for comments.
Yeah, no, just to say, I echo what Richard has said. I think everything that we are doing at Tax Justice and with others in the movement is trying to show the role of tax in that twofold way, both for raising revenue in the immediate and medium term for public services to pay to support communities out of a cost of living crisis, but crucially in the longer term to reduce inequality, to build the kind of society we want to live in. So I think that's why all the reforms that we advocate for aren't ones that just put sticking plasters and would raise money, but ones that really go some way to creating structural and systemic change that can really, hopefully in the long term, transform the kind of place we live in.
Great. And maybe just a specific question to Rebecca. Is there a figure on what an extreme wealth line is yet?
I love this, right? Because I think I've got my own personal figure. There's there's an amazing professor based in the Netherlands called Ingrid Rebens, who wrote a book that came out last year called Libertarianism, the Case Against Extreme Wealth, and she sets a political line at £10 million, dollars, whatever you want to choose. All of that is based on our gut. It's not based on any kind of objective academic research into understanding, okay, at what point does having so much wealth impact the environment? At what point does having so much wealth pose a risk to democracy? And in order for us to have a real answer to that question, we need to have that academic research done. And really excitingly, a group of researchers at the London School of Economics are about to embark on that research. So within the next year or so, we should have the beginnings of a kind of scorecard on, like, this is the point at which extreme wealth becomes harmful on X, Y, or Z. In a perfect world, what we would have is governments and IFIs using a wealth line in the same way that they use a poverty line to try and think about the policies they have and manage out extreme wealth in the way that we manage out extreme poverty. We have to do that if we're serious about inequality and tackling inequality, and we have to do that if we truly believe that extreme wealth causes harm, which we increasingly do. So yeah, that metric will just be a device for us to lock in that narrative and that learning, and make sure that we can't roll back on it. No formal number yet.
Yeah, but there's also something, I guess, which you alluded to about shining a light on it, right? Because people always underestimate, you know, the inequality in the top 1% is so much bigger than the rest.
Yeah,
and
nobody knows.
It's kind of outside the imagination, which is why people come back to kind of thinking that income tax is more ethically right than wealth tax, because actually that's the world that most of us live and work in, right? But actually shining a light more strongly on what that top 1% is like is really part of the shift in the conversation.
It absolutely is. And like the whole narrative that we live with, and the idea that we all live with, that we have to aspire to have more because having more is what we all want and what we all need. The idea that you establish a metric that says actually wealth becomes harmful at this point to you as well as a person. I think there's something really powerful in kind of redesigning how people perceive wealth in developing that metric too.
Great. I think we've come to the end of the questions, unless there's any more hands. So maybe just final comments from speakers about, what they're hopeful for in the tax, work and incomes conversation.
Shall I jump in just real quick?
Rebecca, you kick us off and then I'll go to the other three.
Yeah. I am really hopeful that our approach to tax in this country and the massive support, contrary to what some polls somewhere else might think, for taxing wealth, the overwhelming support from public and millionaires and others, and MPs increasingly for taxing wealth, will provide a really powerful counter and help us work a new narrative and an alternative political vision to the one that we're currently kind of sitting in. And I hope that within this parliament, we not only see policies delivered, but we use that narrative to shape our country in a way that doesn't mean that we're steering ourselves towards a very right-wing government in 2029. So I'm really hopeful that this conversation, this narrative, and the work that's gone on from the movement in the last 4 years can help drag us back to normality and away from horrible polarization.
Thank you. Can I come to you next, Sarah?
Yes, I would like to see the government recognize that there is a return on investment in some of the spending that we're talking about in terms of public services, in terms of investing in social security, and that, you know, raising people out of poverty is also an investment, and you're saving money in other services. And so I would like the government to recognize that spending on these things is not just daily spending. It's not just shouldn't just not be considered current spending, but it also should be considered an investment in society, in the economy as well, and therefore it should be properly resourced, be it through taxes, but also looking at borrowing when necessary.
Great, thank you, Sarah. And Alfie, I'll come to you next, and then Caitlin can wrap up.
Yeah, thanks. I think probably the thought I'm left with is just that although the tax reform agenda is important and we've all spoken to it, in the end, the bigger picture here for me actually is the other themes of this talk in terms of incomes and earnings, because the real jeopardy here is that after 5 years, after this parliament, families are feeling a lot poorer. They are actually a lot poorer, both in terms of the public services that they have access to and in terms of the income that they have, and that the next parliament looks incredibly different to the one we have now as a result of that. And I think the tax reform agenda is utterly fundamental for all the reasons people are given, but it's not the end in itself. It has to be then to enable the sorts of things that various people have talked about on this panel and the questions as well, in terms of the types of society, the types of economy, the types of role for government in supporting people's lives that we want to see. And actually, it's that element which I think is probably the one that I think is most important, and the one where I think there's most to do.
Thank you. And Caitlin, can you finish us off?
Yeah, I mean, I would really agree with everything that's been said already. And yeah, definitely with Alfie's last point on kind of wealth taxes being a place to start, but there is further we need to go if we want to keep transformative change moving and make it sustainable. I think the only thing I would add is just hopeful that, as we've seen with our movement and working with other movements, that people in the general public really start to draw these links between all the different issues that we're talking about, whether that's tax reform, the climate crisis, workers' rights, women's rights, it's beginning to become clearer how interconnected all these issues are. And I think it's through coming together and fighting alongside one another on them that's how we'll win, really. So I'm hopeful for that.
Thanks, Caitlin. Yeah, thanks to all our panelists and all our audience for joining us this evening. Is there anything that Autonomy want to say to kind of wrap up, or are we good to?
I mean, I will simply say we have another online event next week, which will be looking at the UK's role in living standards of the global south. We're drawing a wider global picture to the policy agenda. And then finally, the last of this series of Forum 29 events will be a live Macronos recording in Oxford House in London, where we've had our other live Forum 29 events. That's on Wednesday, the 17th of September. Sign up online. We've got a great panel coming together for that. So yeah, do sign up for those events. But that's all to say. Thank you, Fran, for being a fantastic chair, hitting 8 o'clock basically on the dot. So thanks to Fran. If I'll take it further, I'll say thanks to everyone, and I guess we'll finish up there. Thank you, everyone.
Cheers. Have a good evening, all.